Welcome back, everyone. It's great to be back with you all again for another deep dive. This time, we're tackling a topic that I think a lot of us have probably encountered at some point, emotionally unavailable partners.
Yeah.
We got a really interesting collection of sources for this one. Articles, advice columns, even some insights from relationship therapists.
Yeah, it seems like you're looking to really get a solid understanding of this whole dynamic, huh?
Absolutely. And I think with all these different perspectives, we can cover a lot of ground. So maybe we can start with the basics. Like, what exactly are we talking about when we say emotionally unavailable?
Right, right. So one of the sources described it as like someone who's closed off both from their own feelings and the feelings of others.
Okay, so it's not just about being unable to express their own emotions, but also about not being receptive to the emotions of their partner.
Exactly. And that can show up in so many ways. Like they might have trouble expressing their feelings, avoid commitment, or maybe they constantly need a ton of alone time.
Oh yeah, I've definitely seen that last one play out in relationships before. Someone who just always needs to retreat and recharge on their own.
Yeah, and some of the sources even link this back to childhood experiences and attachment theory. Have you ever, noticed any of these patterns in your own relationships?
That's so fascinating. One source actually talked about how our early experiences can shape our attachment styles, whether we're secure, anxious, avoidant, or even a mix of those.
Right, and it said those styles can have a huge impact on how we approach intimacy later in life, which makes total sense.
It's like those patterns we develop early on kind of become our blueprint for how we navigate relationships as adults.
Exactly. And that's where things can get, tricky because sometimes you end up with that classic push and pull dynamic. Like one partner wants more closeness while the other one keeps pulling away.
Oh, I've seen that too. It's like a constant dance of disconnection almost.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And, understanding those underlying attachment patterns can be so helpful in breaking that cycle. But to really go deeper, I think we need to look beyond just the definition of emotional unavailability.
Like get into the root causes.
Yeah, exactly. Figure out the why behind the what.
Well, one source mentioned past trauma as a potential factor. And that makes sense to me. If you've been hurt before, it's natural to want to protect yourself from getting hurt again.
Right. And it's not always a conscious choice to be emotionally unavailable. Sometimes it's a learned behavior, like a defense mechanism against getting hurt again.
Like their heart is kind of shielded and they don't even realize they're doing it.
Exactly. And another source talked about how societal expectations, especially for men, can play a role. Think about it. We still have that whole boys don't cry mentality. It can make it hard for some guys to open up and be vulnerable.
Oh, there was this one anecdote in an article that really stuck with me. It was about how men might withdraw to process their emotions, not necessarily out of anger or disinterest,
Yeah, I was saying they just need that space to sort things out before they can really engage.
which I think highlights how crucial communication is in these situations. It's about understanding those different styles of emotional processing.
Absolutely. It's so important not to jump to conclusions or make assumptions about what your partner is thinking or feeling.
So we've talked about the what and the why of emotional unavailability.
Mm.
But I think for the person who's actually dealing with this in their own life, the big question is, what can you do about it?
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting. And, a lot of the sources were pretty clear on this point.
Yeah.
You can't fix someone. You can't force them to become emotionally available if they're not ready or willing.
It's not about trying to change them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But, and this is a big BUT, you can definitely change how you approach this situation.
Okay, so it's about focusing on what you can control,
Mm.
which is your own actions and reactions.
Absolutely. And the sources had some great tips for doing just that. For instance, one therapist talked about how important it is to set clear emotional boundaries. Like, what are your needs? What are your deal breakers? And how are you going to communicate those to your partner?
Boundaries are so important in any relationship, but I can see how they'd be especially crucial in this dynamic.
Yeah, and it's not just about setting boundaries, but also about focusing on your own well-being. Making sure you're taking care of yourself emotionally. You can't rely solely on your partner to meet all of your needs, especially if they're struggling with emotional availability themselves.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. It's about having that strong foundation for yourself, independent of the relationship.
Exactly. And then there's the whole communication piece. Like, how do you actually have those tough conversations effectively?
Well, there was this one therapist who suggested using I statements. So instead of saying, you never listen to me, you might try, I feel unheard when I'm trying to share my feelings.
Yeah, that's a classic communication technique. It helps you express your needs without attacking or blaming your partner.
And it can also help prevent them from getting defensive, which can shut down the conversation completely.
Right. And sometimes even if you're using all the right techniques, it can still be tough to get through to someone who's really emotionally guarded.
So what do you do then?
Well, one therapist suggested trying something a little different, like maybe try using code words or gestures if your partner has a hard time verbalizing their feelings.
It's about finding a way to connect that works for both of you, even if it's a little outside the box.
Exactly. And another option is to consider couples counseling. It can provide a safe space to explore those deeper issues and practice healthier communication patterns.
So those are some really helpful tips for navigating the relationship in the present. But what about the bigger picture? Is it even possible for someone to become more emotionally available?
That's the million-dollar question. And while, yeah, change is definitely possible, every expert we looked at agreed on this. It requires self-awareness, a willingness to put in the work, and often some professional help.
So it's not something that happens overnight.
Definitely not. And it's not something you can force on someone. They have to be motivated to change themselves.
That makes sense. You can't want it more than they do.
Right. But if they are willing to put in the effort, individual therapy can be incredibly valuable. It can help them figure out those root causes and develop new coping mechanisms.
So it's about addressing those underlying issues rather than just treating the symptoms.
Exactly. But even with therapy and all the effort in the world, sometimes you have to face that really tough question. Stay or go.
Yeah, that's the ultimate decision point, isn't it?
One therapist we looked at actually laid out these 8 stay or go indicators. 4 reasons to consider leaving and 4 reasons you might consider staying.
Oh, wow, that's interesting. So like a framework for making that decision.
Exactly. And I think it's a really helpful starting point for anyone who's wrestling with this question. It's not about giving you a definitive answer, but rather giving you some things to think about.
So on the go side, what were some of the red flags she mentioned?
Well, she said one big one is if you constantly feel anxious and insecure in the relationship, like you need constant reassurance from your partner, that kind of dynamic can be incredibly draining.
And it sounds like it ties back to that whole pursuer distancer thing we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. If you're always the one chasing after connection, it can be exhausting and it's not sustainable in the long run. And another thing she mentioned, if sexual satisfaction is like super important to you, but your partner consistently has a hard time with intimacy, that could be another sign it's not the right fit.
Oh, yeah, one of the articles talked about that too. Something about how avoidant attachment styles can actually lead to lower levels of both sexual A&D relationship satisfaction.
Exactly. And it's not even just about the physical part. It's about that emotional connection, that intimacy that makes sex really fulfilling. And if that's missing, it can create this huge disconnect.
Right. It's like those two things are intertwined, the emotional and the physical.
Totally. And if one is off, it throws the whole thing out of whack.
Okay, so feeling constantly anxious and insecure, struggling with sexual intimacy, those are two big ones on the go side. What else did she mention?
Let's see. This one's a bit more about like the future of the relationship. She said if you're feeling like you're constantly waiting for your partner to commit or make plans and they're always vague or avoidant about it, that's a big red flag.
Like they're just not on the same page about where the relationship is headed.
Yeah, exactly. And if that's important to you, having that clarity and sense of direction together, it's a problem.
Makes sense. What was the last one on her go list?
This one's probably the most straightforward. If your partner just isn't willing to change, like they refuse to even acknowledge that there's an issue with emotional availability, or they just resist any attempts to work on things.
It's like hitting a brick wall, huh? No matter what you try, nothing changes.
Right. And in that case, it's probably time to start thinking about your own needs and whether the relationship is truly serving you.
So those are the 4 reasons to potentially you. But I'm also curious about the other side of the coin. What were her reasons for staying in a relationship with an emotionally unavailable partner?
Well, she said that if you and your partner both genuinely value your alone time and independence, that dynamic might actually work out pretty well.
It's like instead of it being a source of conflict, that need for space actually becomes a strength.
Yeah, as long as you're both on the same page about it. But she did say that even if that's the case, you got to be realistic about your expectations. Like, you have to accept that your partner might not ever be able to fulfill all of your emotional needs.
It's about finding a balance, I guess,
Hmm.
and having other sources of emotional support in your life.
Right, like close friends or family members who you can talk to and rely on.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, you can't put all your eggs in one basket, so to speak.
Okay, so being on the same page about needing space and having other sources of support, those are two potential reasons to stay. What were the other two?
This one's pretty important. She said that if you truly believe that your partner's emotional distance isn't a reflection of your worth, that's a good sign. Like, you know that their struggles are their own and it doesn't diminish your value as a person.
That's about having that secure sense of self, right? Not letting their stuff become your stuff.
Exactly. And then the final reason, and probably the most important one, is if your partner is genuinely willing to change.
Yeah.
Like they're actively seeking therapy or putting in the effort to become more emotionally available.
In that case, it sounds like staying could actually be a really positive and fulfilling choice.
Yeah, if they're truly committed to growth, it can transform the whole relationship.
I love that. It's about seeing the potential for change and being willing to work towards it together.
Exactly. But even with all this talk about staying or going, I think it's important to remember that there's no one-size-fits-all answer.
Every relationship is unique, right?
Hmm.
And what works for one couple might not work for another.
Absolutely. It's about figuring out what's best for you and your situation. These stay or go indicators are more like guidelines, things to consider as you make your own decision.
It's about tuning into your own intuition and figuring out what feels right in your heart.
Totally. And speaking of tuning in, you mentioned earlier that something about communication really stuck with you. I think it was something about that mirroring technique.
Oh, yeah. That one therapist mentioned it, and I was really intrigued. Have you ever used that with your clients?
Oh, yeah, mirroring is super powerful, especially when you're working with someone who has a hard time expressing their emotions.
So, just to refresh my memory, what exactly IS mirror?
Basically, it's about reflecting back to your partner what you're hearing them say, so they know you're really listening and trying to understand. It's like holding up a mirror to their emotional experience.
So it's less about offering solutions or advice and more about just validating their feelings.
Exactly. It's about saying, I see you, I hear you, and I'm here for you without any judgment.
It creates that sense of safety and being understood, which can be huge for someone who's used to shutting down or pushing people away.
For sure. And you know what else came up a lot in the sources? Those I statements we talked about earlier.
Right, right. Instead of saying, you always do this or you never do that, it's about focusing on how you feel.
Exactly. Like, I feel hurt when you don't call me back, or I feel unappreciated when you don't help out around the house.
It just takes the blame out of the equation and makes it more about expressing your own experience.
And it's less likely to trigger defensiveness in your partner, which can make them more open to hearing what you have to say.
Okay, so mirroring and I statements, those are two great communication tools. Any other tips that stood out to you?
Let's see. Oh, this one might sound a little counterintuitive, especially if you're craving more connection, but sometimes the best thing you can do is actually give your partner some space.
Wait, really?
Mm.
How does that work?
Well, think about that whole pursuer-distancer thing again. Oftentimes, when one person is constantly seeking connection, the other person feels pressured and ends up withdrawing even more.
It's like that self-fulfilling prophecy. The more you chase, the faster they run.
Exactly. And sometimes stepping back and giving them the space they need to breathe can actually be more effective.
It's about trusting that they'll come back to you when they're ready, rather than trying to force it.
And while you're giving them that space, it's super important to focus on taking care of yourself. Make sure you're connecting with friends, doing things you enjoy, and just generally filling up your own cup.
Yeah, because you can't pour from an empty cup,
Mm.
right? That's such a good reminder.
Absolutely. And speaking of pouring, I think it's time we refill our coffee cups. What do you say?
Sounds good to me. We'll be right back after a quick break. Okay, we're back, ready to wrap up our deep dive into emotionally unavailable partners.
While we were getting coffee, I was thinking about something you said earlier about how these relationships, even though they can be tough, can actually be a catalyst for personal growth.
Oh, right. One of the articles talked about that, how even though it's painful, it can force you to confront your own needs and patterns.
Yeah, and that can ultimately lead to, greater self-awareness.
It's like you're forced to look in the mirror and really see yourself, even the parts you might not like.
And sometimes that's where the real transformation happens, when you're challenged and forced to grow.
It's about taking those challenges and turning them into opportunities for learning.
Exactly. And that learning can happen on like a personal level A&D in the relationship itself. You learn more about yourself, but you also figure out how to communicate better, set those healthy boundaries we talked about.
So it's not about changing your partner, but rather about using the experience to grow yourself.
Exactly. And sometimes that growth might even lead you to realize that the relationship isn't right for you anymore. And that's okay too. Sometimes growing means moving on.
That brings us back to that therapist's advice about those stay or go indicators. You mentioned that you found her perspective really helpful.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I thought it was both, practical and compassionate. Like she really got the complexity of these relationships, but she still managed to offer a really clear framework for decision making.
What I really appreciated was how much she emphasized self-care and boundaries. It's so easy to get lost in these dynamics and completely forget about your own needs.
Yeah, it's easy to fall into that trap of trying to fix things or change your partner, but at the end of the day, you have to take care of yourself first.
Right, you can't pour from an empty cup. And I also liked how she talked about the importance of recognizing our own role in the dynamic.
Yeah, instead of just focusing on your partner's emotional unavailability, it's about taking a step back and asking yourself, okay, what am I bringing to this? How are my patterns and behaviors contributing to this dynamic?
It's about taking responsibility for your part in the dance.
Exactly. And she also highlighted that, while change is possible, it requires both partners to be on board. It's not about one person trying to fix the other.
It's a team effort, a shared journey.
Exactly. And one of the articles talked about how even though you can't control your partner, you're not powerless in this situation either.
Oh, right. Like you don't have to just passively accept their emotional unavailability.
Right. You can advocate for yourself, communicate your needs, set those boundaries.
It's about taking those steps to create the kind of relationship you want rather than just settling for what you're getting.
Exactly. And taking action doesn't have to be like aggressive or confrontational. It can be done with love and compassion.
It's about approaching it as a team, wanting to work together to make things better.
Absolutely. And it's about remembering that you deserve love and connection. You deserve to be in a relationship that fulfills you.
This has been such an insightful conversation. I feel like I have a much better understanding of this whole dynamic now.
Yeah, me too. And I think the biggest takeaway for me is just how much hope there is. Even in these tough situations, there's always potential for growth and connection.
Sometimes the hardest part is just acknowledging that there's a problem and being willing to ask for help.
And that's huge. Vulnerability is a strength, and connection is always possible.
So, to our listener, thank you for trusting us with this topic. We hope this deep dive has given you some things to think about and some tools to work with.
Remember, you're not alone in this, and you're worthy of deep, meaningful connections.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.